Thank you, Franz. Is this working? The mic?
Yes.
Seem okay? Great. I'll just stuff it in here. So I first want to say that I'm really pleased and honored to have this opportunity to speak about Yale design and branding. The sources for those aspects of dealing with graphic communication at Yale and about the people who made it what it is. I particularly want to thank Franz, Lisa Sawin, and Julie Ramacha for inviting me and supporting this opportunity to talk with you today. So we're going to start with a little quiz. Well, actually, a preamble. How many of you have graphic design in your title? Oh, good. I probably won't get as much pushback as I would otherwise. So, but I do want to ask you a question at first. There's something extremely wrong with the title up on the screen there that I fought with in Keynote, couldn't fix. It wouldn't work for some reason. What is the problem? Anyone tell me? Yeah, kerning between the Y and the A. Does that bother anyone else? Look at Victor. Yeah. Okay. Very good. So I would ask, this is a relatively small group, so if you have questions as I go along, please just sing out. You don't even have to raise your hand or whatever, just ask. If it's something that, if the answer to it is something I'm going to answer in the course of the prepared talk, I'll just say it's coming. If not, I welcome the interruption. That's just fine. So, okay, the first title I gave this talk was Why Yale? The Sources of Graphic Identity. I liked the catchy ambiguity of asking such an existential question at the beginning of a talk like this, as if our work as designers could rise to such grand heights to question the very existence of the institution. But my actual and very simple goal was to explain and justify why Yale University should have such a plain and typographic logo. We'll kind of get to that in the course of the talk. But in working it out, I realized that almost all of the pieces of Yale's branding and typography were made by Yale students, alumni, staff, and faculty, along with most of the somewhat idiosyncratic approaches to graphic design that drive Yale's web and print communications, from signage to course catalogs to video titling, hence the change to Made at Yale. I'll review the history and practice of design and branding at Yale, focusing on what I think of in rough categories as the 5 pillars of our visual identity. Our heraldry, Yale Blue, our typographic tradition, and the Yale logo. Let's start by looking at Yale's heraldry. While it's not front and center, Yale's heraldic tradition is alive and well. This is the first known use of the Yale seal, the 1746 diploma of Ezra Stiles, who became president of Yale from 1778 to 1784. In 1722, the then rector, the name used before they started calling the president of Yale the president, applied to the Connecticut Colonial Assembly in Hartford for the right to make and use a seal. While it's known that the application was approved, its use is not recorded prior to the 1746 diploma above. It's not known who designed this seal. Here's another view so you can see the details of it. Can you, it's awfully bright in here. Is it possible to knock the lights down a little bit? Because some of what I show will benefit from being able to see some detail. Thank you. But if you can see it, and when you see it, you'll see that it's almost exactly the same form that we here it is in detail, that we use today. That's the current Yale seal, which is literally owned in some ancient property right by Yale's president and corporation, and is only used to validate paper documents issued by them, like diplomas and citations. The shield inside the seal, which has been used apart from the seal since at least the late 1800s, may be used more informally. It's not to be confused with the Yale logo, which is, of course, typographic. Various versions of the Yale Shield have been drawn in the 20th century by such artists as William Addison Dwiggins, John Howard Benson, and I believe that the version on the right here was drawn by, really designed by David Conde, a Yale School of Art graduate, commissioned by the university printer, then university printer Greer Allen in the early 1980s. This shield was cleaned up by Matthew Carter, senior critic in graphic design, who taught at Yale, has been teaching at Yale since about 1978, for use as a glyph in the Yale typeface. And the shield itself, was that me? Probably announcing some, message arriving. These are three different shields. This one was designed by Fudd Benson, who's John Howard Benson's son, and this is Fudd Benson's son, Nick Benson, who carved this beautiful shield in the wall behind the west kind of enclosure wall behind the Beinecke Library. No, perhaps you haven't really gone over to look at it, but it's a real beauty. One of the nice things about heraldry is that it's considered to be an accurate and legitimate heraldic device as long as it contains certain elements like this book with that lettering, this motto, and the shield in almost any shape. So we see lots of different variants of the Yale Shield, and that's all well and good. In relation to the initial title of this talk, Why Yale, it makes sense to point out that the Yale Shield is an especially typographic heraldic device. The primary object of the shield, the charge, as they say in heraldry, the big object on there, is a book or codex, which is itself a container of text, container for text. This is probably representative of the Bible. The Hebrew Urim and Thummim written upon it are text too, albeit in a non-Latin alphabet. And the translation of the Hebrew, as lux et veritas, in the motto banner below the shield, is text as well. I've felt safe all along in kind of understanding that Yale's kind of visual foundations were built of text. So this is an interesting guy. This guy, he's Theodore Sizer, known by everybody as Tubby Sizer. He's director of the Yale Art Gallery, associate director before the war, World War II, and then afterwards for some years. And he was an aspiring, probably somewhat amateur heraldic artist, and he proposed creating shields for the professional schools. Most of the college shields have already been put together by various people, but to further enhance the celebratory feeling of commencements and other celebrations. And and this was very much in line with European universities. He was officially named the university's first pursuivant of arms in 1962 in recognition of his extensive heraldic output. Here he's shown with one of his own hooked rugs, of which he made many. Also, he was a monument man, serving as lieutenant colonel in the MFAA, that's the Army Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program in the early part of World War II. You should, I don't want to take the time now, look him up. He's a totally wonderful character, and a flamboyant lecturer. Apparently he, at one time, literally walked backwards off a stage, pointing to things, and fell flat and became famous thereby. Yes. I can't remember. I'm sorry. But he was one of those incredible people who saved so much of European material culture. So here's Sizer's final sketch for the Yale Law School shield. This shield is what's called a canting arms, which is a shield which makes visual puns on the name of the bearer, and in this case on the names of the school's three founders. Seth Staples, BA 1797, represented in the lower right with literally Staples. David Daggett, which means little dog, represented by a small greyhound. And Samuel Hitchcock, more conventionally, he was BA 1809, represented by the crocodile and the chief. That's the top section of the shield. That top segment is called the chief. And this related to his family's time in Jamaica a couple hundred years earlier in the mid-1600s, when a crocodile was added to their shield, to their coat of arms, as a crest. A crest, this is not a crest. A crest is something that sticks up above the crown and all of the other stuff. It's usually some kind of a fanciful object, and sometimes it was used quite independently of the coat of arms. But Yale doesn't have crests. But in any case, this is an image of the part of the coat of arms of Jamaica, and that's where this what's his name's family had gone to, Samuel Hitchcock. So, in any case, here's Nick Benson's version. Nick is the guy who drew the carved the beautiful shield earlier. This one, he made this in the early 1990s. Notice the Daggett's red collar. That expensive touch was added by Elizabeth Stauderman, BA, 1983, then Director of Public Affairs for the Yale Law School. That required a whole nother printing plate and great expense, but she left her mark on the school. There's the red thing. In 1948, Bruce Rogers, a close friend of Carl Rollins, the first university printer, redrew some of Yale's shields, the residential college shields, and created this beautiful little book that illustrates the arms of Yale College and its then 10 residential colleges. Fritz Cradle drew this unusual condensed version of the university coat of arms. Fritz Cradle was a very well-known, incredibly skillful designer of all kinds of objects, typographic, and was an illustrator. And then he also designed this really quite wonderful coat of arms for Branford College. Most of the colleges have coats of arms that are derived from the family names of the actual families after whom the colleges are named. That's not true of the most recent colleges, however, and I'll talk more about that. So here's the whole current array. Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which is here. Faculty of Arts and Sciences was added in 2016, and 3 new residential college shields were drawn in 2017. Benjamin Franklin, Pauli Murray, and Grace Hopper. I sketched the original approved proposals for those shields, and the final drawings were done by Nick Benson for Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Benjamin Franklin, and Jonathan Poram, Jonathan Edwards College, 1995, finished the drawings of Grace Hopper's arms. Pauli Murray's was drawn in our office. Jason England of YPPS, Yale Printing and Publishing Services, digitally reassembled all the shields, pretty much all of them on the screen, to facilitate their use for spot color reproduction. And considering the number of different ways these things were cobbled up and drawn, that was a real accomplishment. I worked with Stephen Schur, Yale College 1956, and Yale Art History, PhD 66, on the Grace Hopper shields iconography. I go to lengths to mention these contributions because using Yale resources, especially students, faculty, staff, alumni, and as makers and advisors, helps to ensure that the visible and less visible elements of Yale's culture are built into Yale's design and branding. These things are not, they don't come out of, hiring somebody down the street to do them. They come generally out of the hands and minds of people who've spent quite a lot of time at Yale and have an investment in and a knowledge of the institution. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the four shields. This is the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. That includes the mythical beasts, quartered mythical beasts, which represent Yale College, and then another element from the Yale coat of arms, and then these from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences as a kind of marriage of Yale College, Yale University, and the Yale Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. This was drawn by Nick Benson in its final form. This is Benjamin Franklin, again, in a quartered, they call it, arrangement, quartering his scientific and literary and diplomatic accomplishments. This is not his family's arms. His family's arms is filled with, it's first of all probably not legitimate, and secondly has a number of dolphins and beasts and a bend, and it just doesn't hold together as an object. This is Pauli Murray. This one is derived from the Murray name in a kind of backhanded way. Normally in Scotland, the Murray name is connected to a shield with 3 stars on a blue background, 3 argent, 3 white stars on a blue background, and in heraldic history, it's likely that the stars were originally representative of spurs rather than stars per se. So in this case, we've turned the stars into spurs, back into spurs, put them on a red background, and then made it the chief to a counterchanged form that represents the way that Pauli Murray was able really quite gracefully to bridge academic disciplines and gender binaries in a way that makes her truly extraordinary. It also slightly references a mark that she used, which is a kind of equal rights mark with a female symbol attached to it. And this is Grace Hopper, and this one's a little more complicated. There's a piece of the Calhoun saltire, a Calhoun cross at the top. That's called, it's an engrailed bar, and connected to that formally are billets and plates, which are, in this case, kind of referencing ones and zeros for her work in computer science. The heraldic fierce dolphin is emblematic of the animal that was considered to be the king of the sea, and also a guiding light to sailors a kind of wise animal. And so here we are, right? Here is the array of shields by the Apple Store. At the Apple Store's request and expense, Jonathan Poram designed these simplified residential college shields. He's a 1995 graduate of Yale College in East Asian Studies and Studio Art. Poram is now lead science graphics editor at the New York Times. Because of the design requirements of this project, these marks would make effective, if rather heavy, typographic ornaments. There we are. And one of the hard parts here, and you can see how things are kind of joined together, like the three leaves at the top of the shield on the right. That was done in order that there be as few loose parts as possible and as few holes to make in the wall. So the design here was driven by necessity as much as by aesthetics. Shields, especially the Yale University shield, are still used frequently for ceremonial banners and publications, and this is the program for President Salovey's 2013 inauguration. So let's move on to what's probably the most ubiquitous element of Yale's visual identity, which is the Yale Blue. In the early 19th century, Yale athletes, particularly rowing crews, chose green for their shirt or pennant colors. 3 cheers for Yale, long may she be green. By the 1850s, however, blue was apparently worn and flown by most Yale athletes. Ratified as Yale's official color by the Yale Corporation, indeed by the corporation, in 1894, it was defined to be the same color blue used by Oxford University in England. Of course, these things are never entirely pinned down. What we see here are silk scraps of approved dark blue academic robes from the 1930s. Well, I don't have the story behind how they selected this color, and they vary quite a lot too, depending on how they've been exposed to light and air. It's clear that some real effort and care was exercised in choosing it, because these scraps were saved and subsequently referenced as the true Yale Blue in documents, the Holy Grail, recently moved from a safe in Woodbridge Hall to Yale Manuscripts and Archives, where they're being conserved and preserved. Through much of the 20th century, Yale Blue was a noun that was defined in many dictionaries. Here it is. I don't find it very helpful. Yale Blue, a deep blue that is lighter and stronger than Royal Sense 8B, redder and paler than Imperial Blue, and redder and very slightly paler than Napoleon Blue. That really nails it. So Greer Allen, Yale 45W, University printer from 1970 to 1983, once said in a Yale publication, quote, "The specification for Yale Blue, if ever settled once and for all, would leave Yale a bland, boring, and uninteresting university. So my morning prayers regularly include the fervent hope, dear Lord, please have the answers to the questions surrounding Yale Blue and the Vinland map forever elude us." Despite our dear Greer's fervent hopes, pinning down the specs for Yale Blue has regularly engaged the attention of designers, printers, ink manufacturers, and administrators over the decades. In the late 1930s, the approved blue color was analyzed with some kind of colorimeter at MIT, where a lab color profile was output. I'd always thought that lab color was something like, 10 years ago, but apparently it was developed in the proto lab anyway in 1931. In 2006, working with John Robinson, who was Yale College 1970, SOM 1980, we used this chart, these numbers, to generate a calibrated color proof. The result was an intense purple, something like this, not even close, right? I could get how tipping these in different lights could create spectral problems, and maybe that's what happened. But I somehow doubt that the MIT readout was ever practically applied after it was made. This is a wonderful thing. This is also was in the vault and now at Manuscripts and Archives. In December 1940, Yale art professor Lewis York, who was a tempera painter, a technician, he taught kind of painting technology to art students, painted this little cardboard panel. The legend reads, Cobalt Blue, 85%, Permalba, 10%. Permalba is a brand, Weber paint brand of titanium white, Rose Madder, 3, and Ivory Black, 2. The sample has become quite transparent over the years, but it's a wonderful, vibrant blue color, and I referred to it recently when developing our 2007 color swatch book. In 1952 or 53, Alvin Eisenman, head of the Yale Graduate Graphic Design Program from 1950 to 1990, worked with alumnus Bromwell Alt, Sheffield, that was Yale Scientific School, 1922, on the international. He was head of the International Printing Ink Company, and they created a formula for Yale Blue. But by the time I arrived in 1980, 79 or 80, Greer Allen was at that point using the rough approximation of Pantone 289. When I took my current role in 1998, I developed my own creed-like description, which reads as follows. Yale Blue is a dark shade that is readily distinguished from black, that any viewer would call blue. It tends neither toward green nor purple, but it can be a little bit gray. As mentioned, I worked. There's actually the name of a magazine that some Yale undergraduate organization publishes, of which that is the title now. They like that description so much. It's the title of their little magazine. This swatch book that you see was made between 2006 and 2007 to be used for our daily print work and reflects our need for something like a consistent Yale Blue. But that doesn't stop with print. This was an interesting project I had. Can you see that the top of the Yale Scoreboard is quite dark, really sort of a dark, in this light, even black looking. And below it, a bright blue that looks kind of red. And so this was all done before the opening of the season. I can't remember what year it was, but in any case, Rick Levin showed up, and I got a phone call right after the game. I think it was on a Saturday. The blue has got to go. It's got to be changed. And so this, a few days later, we got the company that had painted it to come, and they explained that the top section is perforated so that you see black with the blue, and that mixed black and blue and darkened it so that it actually ended up looking like Yale Blue, whereas the rest of the scoreboard kind of held out the paint, and so it looked too bright and blue. So what they're doing up there is they're holding a painted panel that they had made that they felt would be a decent match, and we ended up repainting it, and Rick was happy. But you can see what he's doing. You know, no expense or trouble spared for Yale Blue. This color is the Yale Screen Blue, the Yale Web Blue, and it was developed by Andrea McAdam and Victor Velt of Yale's Office of Public Affairs and Communications to be a kind of spiritual equivalent of Yale Blue for print. It's not as heavy or dark, but it's not as overwhelmingly shrill as the blue that we had been using was. I couldn't be happier with it, and I think it's a great representation. Of course, on paper or on screen, all color is pretty hard to render exactly. So it's a kind of aiming for something that ends up giving, in most display situations, a good general effect. The next pillar is Yale's typographic legacy. And it's probably the aspect of Yale's identity that runs deepest, but it's also the hardest one to define. It's really easy to recognize Yale Blue or to use Yale's heraldry, but it's difficult to confidently say that a piece of current typographic work channels Yale, but we try. Here is the 1748 printed rules or laws. It's what you had to do in order to, to stay on the right side of the leadership at Yale. And it was written in Latin. It was written in Latin until 1772 or 3 or 4, here 74, when it was determined that there was too much debate about, what the rules meant. Latin was, left a little too much open for speculation. So here it is in English. These were both printed by local print shops. This one in New Haven, the prior one in New London. The next nearest print shop was in New York City, probably about equidistant from New London, but the colonial forces brought New London and New Haven closer at that point. If the name Samuel Green and the surname Green shows up from the earliest days of printing in Boston through to the 19th century in Connecticut, a really important printing family. So in this prior one, you can see the Yale-ensis there with a great big space between the Y and the A. I almost expect that Y was carved out of wood or something. It's an incredibly kind of funky thing, but with lots of vitality, and we'll talk a little more about that in relation to Carl Rollins. Okay, here's a later one. This is a catalog of courses, actually of the faculty and students of the university, and you notice that it's in decorative typefaces. These were probably faces that could now be obtained locally from New York or Philadelphia, and this was the style of the time. The effort was to be picturesque. I can probably say at this point that Yale didn't really have a graphic identity until the 20th century, until Carl Rollins came along and made that happen. Until that time, it was probably more or less either left to the whim or to the necessity of what was, there in the type cases in whatever shop here in New Haven or elsewhere the print work was being done. So it's kind of an interesting thing we could talk about at length too, which is how necessity is and scarcity of typographic material is somewhat at the heart of Yale's graphic identity. So here's Carl Rollins. He came to Yale in 1918. He was employed from 1918 until 1960. He retired officially in 1948. He attended Harvard for 2 or 3 years. Didn't even want to get a degree. He just wanted to do reading, and the material was accessible to him there. He had been a printer in his early years in Montague, Massachusetts, at a utopian community called New Clairvaux. His work there is extraordinary. I'm going to show you just a little bit of it. But when he came to Yale, he left a lot of that kind of job print shop vitality behind. Interestingly, he was an active socialist in his early years, and somehow that convinced him that he didn't need to save for his retirement. So blind and really essentially unable to work in 1948 when he retired, he had no money whatsoever. And the university, I think out of kind of empathy and admiration for him, permitted him to stay on, occupying an office with Alvin Eisenman, who was the head of the graphic design program. And he would sit over the work like this all day long, and he would, help Alvin do things, but it was all done, at that kind of distance. It's kind of a sad end for somebody who had been so important. He had been a household name in the book design world. His influence as a designer, writer, and teacher extended beyond Yale to the wider communities of designers, printers, and book collectors. He wrote articles, and he wrote poetry. He was quite a remarkable printer, designer, and scholar. His stature at Yale and beyond account for the fact that Yale is the site of the first graduate-level graphic design program in the United States, and that it still employs a university printer as its general art director. If it weren't for him, his work, I wouldn't be standing here before you. So let me show you a couple things that Rollins did in his early years at Montague. All of this, by the way, is at the Arts of the Book collection and the special collections of the Haas Family Arts Library. You can just go and ask to see boxes of his material, something like 50 feet of shelf space devoted to largely scrapbooks. He paste everything into scrapbooks, so it's pretty well documented. This is a receipt printed at Montague. Note the use of Caslon, which is the big typeface at the top, and Garamond at the bottom, two very common typefaces used at Yale, and interestingly, quite closely related to our Yale typeface through the history of the earlier face, the Yale face, and its forebear, so to speak, in Europe. This rich and compact mix of typographic textures reminds me of the early Yale Statuta that we saw. While it's attempting to assume Rollins's style here reflects the American colonial revival raging at the time, first 2 decades of the 20th century. But I link it instead to his admiration for the Baroque typography of Shakespeare's time. Here, quite literally, is an announcement for a Montague community production of Shakespeare, which mimics the typesetting and printing of the 1620s. Rollins subsequently brought this style, what he called the, quote, hardy crudity of Caxton and the Baroque printers, to much of his Montague work, but to preciously little of his subsequent work for Yale Press. On the other hand, he took real pleasure in working out the details of the materials that supported the texts of scholarly publications. The footnotes list indices, contents, pages, etc. And out of that, I believe he was able to get a sense of that sort of textual activity. This kind of runs against it, though. We see vitality here, but without a hint of crudity, in a 1934 title page for the Journal of a Lady of Quality, published by Yale Press, considered one of his best books. Rollins did not think of himself as a draftsman or artist in any sense. He frequently called on his freelance colleagues W.A. Dwiggins, Bruce Rogers, or Robert Galvin, who drew many of Yale's early 20th century maps, to provide illustrations and sometimes hand lettering. That's the title page. And the title page of this little book is in some ways the philosophical culmination of Rollins's Yale Press work, published in 1949, a year after his retirement. Here, he outlines approaches to scholarly typography, taking delight in the details and applying a lot of brain power to aspects of typography that many designers find tedious. In Rollins's freelance and private press work, like this Heritage Presswalden, illustrated by Thomas Nason, he tended to draw more obviously from his Montague Press roots. It's difficult to assess the long-term effect on Yale's graphic identity of Rollins' prolific freelance output. In general, it was noticeably livelier work employing a larger typographic palette, and because much of this side work was connected with publishing deluxe collector's volumes, most of these were also richly illustrated by acclaimed artists and beautifully printed and bound. He led a kind of double life that he spoke about quite often, especially in correspondence with Dwiggins. He saw the requirement of working for the press as a kind of bind. And I think that, which is true of working at any university. At Yale, the importance of doing quality work of all kinds, which you all recognize, is an absolute assumption, a reflection of the university's standards and values. But since the making of physical objects and design communications is not the university's core product, as it would be for a design office, there is seldom budget or support staff to do design work in a way that's entirely gratifying to thoughtful practitioners. Rollins solved this common problem by burning the candle at both ends and getting work of the kind he especially loved from clients outside of Yale who had the resources to pay for all that he could bring to his projects. More to the point of the talk, however, is that Rollins' tenure is surely the period during which Yale had the most consistent and recognizable graphic identity. Since Rollins designed or immediately oversaw every piece of work at the Yale Press, that work had the integrity of an individual artist's body of work. Remember, too, that Yale Press in Rollins' time printed everything from books to shipping labels to application forms to football tickets to, to tags for drawers, anything that's now maybe done at YPPS or on your own copy machines or printing machines in the office. Here's a wonderful cartoon of Rollins drawn by Bruce Rogers. He was multi-talented. He traveled whenever he could back to Montague to rebuild the dam that he'd run his presses from, the water power. So you can see him moving rocks, cutting down trees, setting type, inking the type, and there he is with a miniature hand press in his right hand. That's Yale's campus below him, between his legs, as it were, and that's a little man with was it W-A-D, I believe? Maybe it's Bruce Rogers, Dwiggins who drew it. I can't remember, but it has the name of the artist on there in any case. Today, the university printer has almost no direct connection to the work of Yale Press, and university printing and publishing activities are so numerous and emanate from so many silos that what was once subsumed by a single designer's vision has become the work of many designers and ad hoc publishers, as well those of you who work here at Yale know. This is the large Albion hand press that Rollins bought for the bibliographical press that he established with the English professor Arthur Elliott Case in the late 1920s, with the support of with the support of librarian Andrew Keogh. The press was installed in Sterling Library at the time of its opening, the library's opening in 1931, where it functioned as a learning lab, so to speak, for the next decade. Today, it's under the aegis of Jay Rossman, and it's available for use by students, faculty, interested staff, if you connect with her about it. But the presence of the press in Rollins' day and potentially now raises the academic profile of the book-related typographic crafts at Yale. I venture to say even for any of you who are using type in any form in your work, digital or otherwise, it laid the groundwork for the subsequent establishment of the Graphic Arts program in the Yale School of Art. So this is a picture of Richard Rose, a Yale community member and faculty member working with a student in Jonathan Edwards College, in a kind of piece of inheritance from Rollins' days. Also, the wonderful Tom Strong has created the graphics, the silkscreened texts on the windows of the Jonathan Edwards College Press. So this is Alvin Eisenman, who was the never named the university printer, but he took over from Rollins, and he filled Rollins's role with the help of John McCrollis between 1950, when he was hired, and 1970, when Greer Allen was brought aboard as a full-time designer and production manager. Right from the start of his employment at Yale, Alvin served both as chief designer for the press and director of the new program in graphic arts established by Joseph Albers and Charles Sawyer and Alvin. And Alvin understood and honored Rollins' typographic legacy at the press, while he enthusiastically promoted a modernist aesthetic and embraced emerging technologies, especially computer typesetting. On the left is a wonderful workaday piece of design from 1952 by Alvin, and on the right, one of the annual course catalogs that were handled by the press, now handled by the Office of the University Printer. It's a poetically clever melding of centered and flush left typography. If you look at it, you see Bulletin of Yale University in the series, flush left, but School of Architecture and Design and the list of 5 subjects below it centered. Somehow it works absolutely, and it's quite a trick to do something like that. I would say, I'd call it visually poetic, even though it's a very workaday sort of thing. And here's a poster that Alvin made. Alvin brought Paul Rand, here's a piece of Paul Rand's famous poster, Alvin Lustig, Walker Evans, Herbert Matter, Armin and Dorothea Hoffman, Bradbury Thompson, Inga Druckery, Rudy de Harek, Wolfgang Weingart, Chris Pullman, Matthew Carter, and many other prominent designers and photographers to Yale to teach. A few of them, like Rand, Chris Pullman, and Matthew Carter, took on projects for university organizations as well, contributing directly to Yale's visual identity. Alvin was followed by Greer Allen, who served as university printer from 1970 to 83. Greer had worked for Carl Rollins when he was an Yale undergraduate. Greer was a brilliant manager and a terrific designer who always, as he put it, designed by listening. He told me once that he tried to design work that looked like the creation of his clients, and had the clients been trained designers. The result was an enormously eclectic body of work for Yale, much of it museum exhibition catalogs, but also lots of practical Yale pieces, like the beautifully complex Yale College programs of study done here in the 1980s. That was used until the late 80s, replaced each round simpler and simpler and simpler, and now the course leaf version of it requires a much more kind of, I guess you'd say, useful but visually pedestrian sort of piece. And here's another piece of Greer's work just to show his typographic range. Greer retired in 1983 to more fully serve his many clients. He was followed by Roland Hoover as university printer, and Hoover was an incredibly able graphic designer. And this is a wonderful thing he did for the Beinecke Library, where it's an essay about things rather than books and manuscripts in the Beinecke Library's collection. And what he's done is interlineated the actual things, and they run through the entire book between every line of type, all the things, which is a piece of computation and collaboration with the curators to make this kind of thing happen. His work certainly influenced Yale's designers at the time, but I think it would be fair to say that he far preferred working on the letterpress and the typewriter to lithographic or digital alternatives. I'll never forget his getting out his manual typewriter there in 1993 and typing away on it when we're all learning the computers and had been working with them for many years. He didn't do that. I think that was hard for him and subsequently for certainly not because of any lack of skill, visual skill on his part, but because he really didn't move into the 21st century. So here are just a few kind of takeaways from this much richer kind of story that we've been looking at. Some of the results of this for Yale are that we tend to use a single typographic alignment throughout our work. We're either centered or we're flush left. And those are the settings there. And also generally a less is more approach to design, to ornament and color particularly.